Well, basically going to be heading out back to the East Coast, leaving the West Side from here, Arizona, heading to a new contract. And it came a little short because, like I said before in other videos, in the hospitals, they're trying to get staff members to agree to, the whole male, female, you're not a man, you're a woman sort of thing. And so, of course, they do this through in servicing. And I told them, I'd say, as a Christian, it's not something that I could do. I believe in what the Bible states that in the beginning God made them male and female. And of course, there is no religious exemption for any of that stuff. So I told them I was leaving. So cut my contract a little short, and of course they basically begged me to stay because they were so short. But they were like, "Well, all you got to do is just sign off on the training. It's not that big a deal." And realistically speaking, it isn't. It isn't that big a deal to do a little, you know, it's like a long video. You don't even have to watch it. You let it auto play in the background, and it's all propaganda. And most of the people that I've come in contact with at the hospital realize that it's messed up, but they're just like, what are they gonna do? But the problem is that even in the early steps, people just go along to get along. They think, well, it's not that big a deal. All you're doing is you're just basically attesting uh, this fact that, and this is with minors. This isn't with the adults. The gearing of the teaching is geared towards minors. And so I had said straightforwardly, I work as a nurse. I've been a nurse 12 years. And I had said, well, we don't do this with schizophrenic patients. We don't do this with Alzheimer's patients. Like my Alzheimer's patient, I had that same night um, where I had this discussion. I said, this gentleman thinks he's going to work in the morning. He was like 80 something years old, bedbound, living in a nursing home. And the guy's ringing the bell saying, hey, I got to get up. I got to go to work. I got work in the morning. I got a construction job I got to go to. And of course, as nurses, we don't sit there and play along with what they're doing. We are responsible for redirecting the patient to reorient the patient to reality, right? You say, no, you came from a nursing home, you're here for an infection, you're here in a hospital, and I am your nurse. And sometimes patients will continue to be confused. And many of these people typically have mental health disorders. Many of the ones that I've come in contact with are bipolar, schizophrenic. They've got anxiety, depression, PTSD, the whole works. Many of these patients are on medications, polysubstance abuse. So to sit here and to go this route, it's obviously not about the patient. And you have some weak-minded individuals. You have some people in society that literally would not exist if it was not for socialism. That's just a fact. So just look at the elderly, right? Most boomers don't care if the entire system collapses as long as they get their social security check because they're completely dependent on the government. They have this mentality of, well, I paid for it. And it's just not true. The amount of money that they put in by comparison to the amount of money that they get out, especially through healthcare, it's pennies. The contribution is pennies on the dollar that many people put into the system in any event. It kind of is what it is. So I decided I was just gonna leave. I mean, realistically speaking, I was already on borrowed time um, after COVID. I was literally ready to leave the country if I could not back in 2020. If especially with what they were looking to do, right? Lockdowns, climate agenda, um, perpetual masking, limitation of movement. You just have to be willing to walk away from communism. That's all that it is. It's just communism. At the end of the day, this is what you get when you have too many parasites in the system, and you're going to end up with shortages. Just look at Canada. Canada is a perfect example of there's so many people on social media posting that they can't afford to live. They can barely get by working because they're paying so much in taxes. And many people who can afford to leave Canada for healthcare will come to America because they can pay and push the line. Not so much in Canada because there's just way too many patients, and the government limits how much money these individuals get in the hospitals. It's a less of a free market. In America, because America is a consumer economy, they have to provide fake jobs and they have to go this route. And we're a consumer economy. So it's to the government's benefit to have people consume, become overweight, because most of what they buy comes from overseas. Food, production, clothing, etc. It comes from overseas. So it keeps the dollar relevant in other countries who want to do business in a dollar. And then because the government prints those dollars, they can give them to their citizens via welfare, via corporate welfare, via fake jobs, etc. Because those dollars will go overseas. And in essence, what America is doing is they're exporting their inflation and they're exporting debt. So these nations become indebted by taking on the dollar, by taking on a fiat currency, by taking on the dollar. They in essence are they're voluntarily putting their country in debt, and this is how America is able to. This is the only reason why it works, because nobody's out there trying to get the Canadian dollar, right? Nobody's out there trying to get the Mexican peso. The only reason people need the dollar is because it's the reserve. Many countries are forced to hold on to it because commodities are being uh, forced. You have to buy commodities in dollars, and of course now that is not going to be the case. Now, with what was going on, in my opinion, of what was going on in Europe, you had certain people in Europe that were pushing for de-dollarization. This is what Klaus Schwab was talking about. If you listen to some of his stuff, he often talked about how they were going to create basically a basket currency where they take all these different currencies, put them all together, and it's called an SDR. And what they wanted to do is they wanted that to be utilized via the IMF to be the currency that would be used for global change, for global exchange, because basically America holds the reins of commodities. If your currency is what is used to buy commodities, you in essence control the cost of commodities. Either you can drive commodities down or you can drive commodities up. And this is what you see. This is what you see now. Like commodity prices are very high because of the shortages, the breaking down of the supply chain. And of course, all of this was planned to go forward. Now, if you have certain countries that are commodity exporters or importers that don't want to go along with the agenda, well, then what you would do is you would create lockdowns. This is what you're seeing in Europe and in parts of the UK, where they're going to have 15-minute cities, unless you go green, sort of nonsense. And it's just to limit movement because many of these countries can't afford energy because they don't produce energy in their own countries. And so, how do you tell your citizens that we can't afford energy moving forward? Well, the only way to do it is to limit movement. You put people on bicycles, on e-bikes, tell them you force them to get an electric vehicle, because the actual goal is to limit the amount of energy being imported. If you think about it, think about what America did to Germany, what America did to Europe. America completely sabotaged Europe by creating this proxy war with Russia and destroying the pipeline, and then selling LNG, natural gas, to Europe to the point where Europe had to go back to burning coal over the winter so that the people didn't freeze. Who did this? Was this Putin that did this? No, it was the United States. It was the United States attacking Europe economically. Now, Europe is basically a vassal after I think it was World War One, World War Two, I forget. They basically became a vassal. Much of Europe became a vassal nation to the United States in conglomerate with the UK. And so you see this concept of 15-minute cities in much of that area because it's their way to push back against the rise in the need for commodities, for especially for oil and for energy, because they don't produce it, and oil and cheap oil is becoming more expensive, and overwhelmingly it's in places like in Middle East and in with Russia, and of course to they don't have access to Russian oil anymore, and basically America has bases in that entire country, in that entire region. So this is why you heard the president of France, when Macron went to China, he was basically denouncing the United States, because he understands what's going on. He understands what the United States is doing to Europe. And if you look during with if you have a collapsing society that is primarily white, how do you move how do you shift people demographically from one area to another? This is what the president of Mexico was talking about, and I believe the president of Ecuador, where he was saying basically what you're doing by causing inflation and by creating all these welfare programs, you're creating the shift in people, and you're pulling the poor out from places like Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, etc., and you're pulling them into your country. And these people, as much as people complain, these people will be the the slaves. They will be your lowest form of labor in the country, because somebody has to pay the taxes. Someone has to pay the taxes. Somebody has to be there to consume, because Americans are not consuming enough, because Americans are happy living in poverty. They're not continuing to borrow money. They're not continuing to go out there. They're not having children. So how do you keep the system rolling? You have to import people. And so that's how you'll get your lowest workers. But your skilled labor is overwhelmingly going to come from white European nations. And so with the rising cost of energy in Europe, Europe is basically saying our manufacturing is leaving. Our manufacturing and our businesses are going to America, because America is offering them basically either low cost loans or zero interest loans to basically move their entire manufacturing over into America. And this was the point. Is basically, as your country demographically is collapsing, you have to be able to pull from peoples. You're going to pull your low wage workers from black and brown countries, and you're going to pull your more skilled labor from European nations, and squeeze the shit out of those countries. The only thing that Europe can do is basically create pseudo lockdowns for their inhabitants, because they don't have the skilled workers and they don't have the population to keep up with all the entitlements. So they have to restrict people. They have to restrict movement. This is what, in my opinion, is going on. And of course, the WHO Treaty, which is just an extension of the United States. The United States runs the World Health Organization via the corporations. And like I said before, to keep your standard of living high when your population is going lower, it's just like, when they had sharecropping, or when they had lords of the land. Just because you had a bad yield doesn't mean my cut gets cut. If you have a bad yield, that's your problem. I still get my cut, and my cut remains the same, whether there's nothing left for you afterwards, or what you have left is diminished. And this is basically what we're watching happening in the global market, where America is basically doing global economic warfare. This is basically what is going on. And a lot of these lockdowns and restrictions with C-19 and the climate agenda, this is overwhelmingly, in my opinion, the purpose. Is you have all of these nations. It's literally like Age of Empires. If you've played Age of Empires, you should understand what is going on economically, because it's literally the same. It's literally the exact same thing. And so moving forward, this is why it was funny when there's been cartels and fentanyl moving back and forth between Mexico and the United States. When Mexico said that they wanted to join the BRICS nations. This was when, I forget what politician it was, where they were like, you know what, maybe we need to send in special forces into Mexico to take a look at these fentanyl traffickers. And that was basically the excuse for the United States telling Mexico, don't get any ideas of allying with them because we will invade you. Under the guise of, oh, we're going to handle the fentanyl issue. And of course, that disappeared, right? That disappeared as quickly as that, I forget which politician, I think it was Kerry, or the other guy, I forget his name. Anyway, this is basically what's going on. But it's not like back in the days where it was overtly in your face. You had men who were much more aggressive physically. What you see nowadays is much more of the quiet diplomacy, right? It's the iron hand in a velvet glove is basically what we're watching. And so when you see all these countries that are like, oh, we're locking down, we're doing this, it's just economic warfare is basically what is going on. And we're going to see a lot more of it. And the restrictions, as things get worse, will obviously get worse here. You'll see more Americans falling into poverty because you have a lot of people that are entitled and just don't want to work. Shit, even with my own family, I see this with young people. Young people just don't want to put in a hard day's labor. They see the amount of wealth and they're like, oh, it should just be this easy to live this wealthy, not realizing that for America to have this standard of living, they are literally causing poverty in many nations and causing much suffering to go along. Anyway, this video is getting a little bit long in the tooth. I'm going to leave it here. It's going to be a couple days drive heading cross country again. Get to see the beautiful land, spy out the land. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. Thanks for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are in regards to what is going on with the 15-minute cities, the proposed lockdowns, climate agenda. What do you think is really going on with the war in Ukraine, to see what is going on? Overwhelmingly, think about it. Who has been overwhelmingly impacted? Think about this. This is another point. India buys oil from Russia. They refine that oil and then they send that oil at a higher price to Europe. So Europe is now paying a middleman's price to India because America says you can't buy oil from Russia. Who was really the target? Was it Russia? Or was it Europe? Anyway, leave it here. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.